The First World War not only marked the beginning of a new era in history but also the tragic end of a generation. In the trenches, while the world burned, there were men who wielded not only rifles but also pens. Men who turned devastation into poetry, battles into metaphors, and tragedy into eternity. This is the legacy of the writers who died in the Great War. Wilfred Owen, born in 1893, was one of the most influential poets of the war. His poems such as Dulce et Decorum Estate and Anthem for Doomed Youth captured the horrors of life in the trenches with unprecedented rawness. Wilfred Owen was born in Oswestry, Shropshire, England, to a middle-class family. From an early age, he showed an interest in poetry and literature, influenced by authors like John Keats and Percy Bysshe Shelley. Owen aspired to be a poet even before the war, although his early works received little recognition. After completing his studies, he worked as a tutor in England and France and spent some time as an assistant to a clergyman, which shaped his spirituality and interest in ethical dilemmas. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Owen was in France working as a tutor. He returned to England in 1915 and enlisted in the British Army in 1916. He served as an officer in the Manchester Regiment and was sent to the Western Front in France. The battlefield experience profoundly changed Owen. He witnessed unspeakable horrors, poison gas attacks, severe injuries, and the constant deaths of his comrades. In 1917, he suffered a nervous breakdown, what would now be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, and was sent to recover at Craiglockhart War Hospital in Scotland. At Craiglockhart, Owen met poet Siegfried Sassoon, who greatly influenced his artistic and political development. Sassoon, also a poet known for his critical views on the war, encouraged Owen to write about his war experiences with greater realism and honesty. Under this influence, Owen composed some of his most powerful poems, including Dulce et Decorum Estate, Anthem for Doomed Youth, and Exposure. Despite his recovery, Owen voluntarily returned to the front in 1918, stating that he felt obligated to share in the suffering of his men. He died in combat on November 4, 1918, during an attack on the Sambre-Oise Canal in France, just 1 week before the armistice that ended the war. Although Owen published only a few poems during his lifetime, his work gained recognition posthumously. His poetry was published in 1920 thanks to Siegfried Sassoon and Edmund Blunden. Today, Wilfred Owen is remembered as an essential voice of the First World War, a witness who humanized the horrors of the conflict and left a literary legacy that continues to move generations. His poetry not only captured the soldiers' suffering but also raised profound questions about the human cost of war and the morality of the leaders who perpetuate it. In an era that often celebrated war, Owen offered a perspective that sought truth, compassion, and justice. Rupert Brooke, 1887–1915, was an English poet known for his early, idealistic, and romantic work on the First World War. Although his life was brief, his poetry, especially the war sonnets, made him an emblematic figure in British literature, reflecting a vision of war very different from that of later poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon. Rupert Chawner Brooke was born on August 3, 1887, in Rugby, Warwickshire, England, to a well-off family. His father was a teacher at the prestigious Rugby School, where Rupert also studied. From a young age, he excelled academically, with physical attractiveness and charisma that made him popular among his peers. Brooke entered the University of Cambridge in 1906, where he studied at King's College. During this time, he associated with the Bloomsbury Group, a circle of intellectuals and artists, and the Fabian Society, a socialist organization. He also began writing poetry and developing his literary career. Brooke was known for his physical beauty as well as his intelligence, earning admirers and friends in artistic and literary circles. However, his emotional life was complex. He experienced doubts about his sexuality, tumultuous love affairs, and a constant search for meaning and stability. These personal experiences influenced his work, especially his more introspective poems. When the conflict broke out in 1914, Brooke, like many young men of his generation, saw it as a noble and just cause, an opportunity for adventure and sacrifice for the nation. Brooke joined the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve and participated in missions abroad. In 1914, he wrote a series of 5 sonnets titled 1914 and Other Poems, which included his most famous work, The Soldier. In this poem, Brooke describes death in war as a form of communion with England, glorifying sacrifice and connection to the homeland. An excerpt from The Soldier. If I should die, think only this of me. That there's some corner of a foreign field. That is forever England. These verses, full of patriotic idealism, resonated deeply with the British public at the beginning of the war, before the brutal realities of the conflict became widely known. In 1915, Brooke was sent to the Mediterranean as part of the Gallipoli expedition. However, he never saw combat. During the journey, he contracted septicemia from a mosquito bite and died on April 23, 1915, aboard a ship near the Greek island of Skyros. He was only 27 years old. Brooke represents the early phase of war literature when hope and patriotism still dominated the collective imagination. His poems, especially The Soldier, remain studied as a powerful expression of initial feelings toward the war, before the experiences of the trenches profoundly changed public perception. Although his work does not address the horrors of war as later poets' work did, Brooke left an indelible mark on English literature, reminding us of the complexity and emotional impact of the First World War on his generation. Charles Pégouy, 1873–1914, was a French poet, essayist, and thinker whose work, deeply influenced by his Catholicism, patriotism, and sense of social justice, made him a unique figure in French literature and thought. He died early, at the beginning of the First World War, but his literary and intellectual legacy has endured as a bridge between religious mysticism, political philosophy, and poetry. Charles Pégouy was born on January 7, 1873, in Orleans, France, into a humble family. His father, a carpenter, died when Charles was very young, leaving the family in poverty. His mother worked as a chairmaker, and Pégoui's education benefited from the French state scholarship system. He was a brilliant student and won a scholarship to attend Lycée Le Canal in Sceaux and later the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. There, he studied philosophy and was deeply influenced by the thought of Henri Bergson, whose concepts of intuition and spirituality shaped Pégoui's later work. Although he grew up in a secular environment, Pégouy experienced a profound spiritual transformation throughout his life. Initially, he was a committed socialist, influenced by ideas of social justice and the fight against inequality. In his youth, he was active in socialism and admired figures like Jean Jaurès. Over time, however, Pégouy distanced himself from the socialist movement, primarily due to his growing interest in Christian faith and his rejection of the anti-clerical politics of many French socialists. In 1908, he returned to Catholicism, though he maintained a personal, non-institutional relationship with the Church. This spiritual conversion led him to explore themes of faith, sacrifice, and morality in his poetry and prose. Pégouy was deeply patriotic and saw France as a nation destined to fulfill a moral mission in the world. When the First World War broke out in 1914, he enlisted in the French army as a reservist, despite being over 40 years old and exempt by age. For him, the conflict represented a just fight for France's freedom and honor. He died in combat on September 5, 1914, during the Battle of the Marne, just a day before France achieved a decisive victory. His early death turned Pégouy into a tragic figure, a poet martyr who embodied the ideals of sacrifice and faith he championed. Isaac Rosenberg, 1890–1918, was an English poet and painter, widely recognized as one of the most distinctive voices of the First World War. His work, acclaimed for its artistic sensitivity and profound introspection, captures the horrors of war from a unique perspective, shaped by his humble origins, Jewish identity, and innovative approach to poetic language. Isaac Rosenberg was born on November 25, 1890, in Bristol, England, to a Jewish family of Lithuanian origin who had emigrated to escape pogroms. The family lived in poverty, and when Rosenberg was 7, they moved to London, settling in the working-class neighborhood of Whitechapel. From a young age, Rosenberg showed artistic talent in both painting and poetry. However, due to his family's financial limitations, he left school at 14 and began working as an apprentice engraver to help support the household. Despite these challenges, Rosenberg never abandoned his artistic aspirations. With the support of friends and benefactors, he studied art at the Slade School of Fine Art in London, where he interacted with prominent artists like Stanley Spencer and Dora Carrington. During this time, he also began writing poetry more seriously. His work from this period reflects his interest in universal themes like mortality, spirituality, and the struggle for identity, as well as the influence of his Jewish heritage and his fascination with nature. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Rosenberg did not share the patriotic fervor that motivated many to enlist. However, his financial situation led him to join the army in 1915, as he could not secure stable work as an artist or poet. Rosenberg was assigned to the Suffolk Regiment and later the Lancashire Regiment. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Rosenberg served as a private, allowing him to closely experience the hardships and suffering of frontline soldiers. On April 1, 1918, Isaac Rosenberg was killed in action near Arras, in northern France, during a German offensive in the First World War. He was 27 years old. His body was never recovered, and his name is commemorated on the Pozieres Memorial, which honors British soldiers who fell on the Western Front. Edward Thomas, 1878–1917, was an English poet and literary critic who became one of the most important voices of First World War poetry. Although he began his career as a critic and prose writer, Thomas found his true vocation as a poet shortly before his death in the conflict. His work is characterized by a deep love of nature, introspective melancholy, and a unique sensitivity to capturing the small details of everyday life. Philip Edward Thomas was born on March 3, 1878, in Lambeth, London, into a middle-class family with Welsh roots. From an early age, he showed an inclination toward literature and nature, which deeply influenced his later work. Thomas attended St. Paul's School in London and later studied history at Lincoln College, Oxford. During this time, he met Helen Noble, whom he married in 1899. Their relationship was intense but often challenging, marked by Thomas's emotional instability and the couple's financial difficulties. Although initially hesitant about the war, Edward Thomas enlisted in 1915 in the Artists' Rifles, a volunteer regiment. He was later transferred to the Royal Garrison Artillery, where he served as an officer. His decision to join the army was complex, influenced by both his love for England and a personal desire to confront his own uncertainties. During his service, Thomas continued writing poetry, often inspired by his experiences in the army and his connection to the English landscape. Despite the harsh conditions of the front, his writing reached new depths, exploring the tension between the beauty of nature and the destruction of war. Edward Thomas died on April 9, 1917, during the Battle of Arras in France. He was struck by an artillery shell while at his observation post. He was 39 years old. His death was a devastating loss to his family and friends, particularly Robert Frost, who considered him one of the finest poets of his time. Edward Thomas left behind a remarkable poetic legacy, despite having started writing poetry only 3 years before his death. His work, published posthumously, has been celebrated for its sensitivity to nature and its ability to capture the emotional complexities of life. Unlike other war poets like Wilfred Owen or Siegfried Sassoon, Thomas's poetry does not focus directly on the horrors of conflict but rather on more intimate reflections on loss, memory, and the connection to the English landscape. This makes him a unique figure in First World War literature. Today, Edward Thomas is recognized as one of the great poets of the 20th century, whose work continues to inspire for its clarity, humanity, and emotional depth. His poem Adlestrop, in particular, has become a symbol of a lost England, before the devastation of the war. Guillaume Apollinaire, 1880–1918, whose birth name was Wilhelm Albert Vladimirs Apollinari de Kostrowicki, was a French poet, playwright, novelist, and art critic of Polish-Italian descent. He is considered one of the most influential poets of the 20th century and a pioneer of the avant-garde movement. His work is characterized by formal innovation, boundless imagination, and his ability to blend the modern with the classical. He was also a fervent advocate of Cubism and a precursor to Surrealism. Guillaume Apollinaire was born on August 26, 1880, in Rome. His mother, Angelica Kostrowica, was an impoverished Polish noblewoman, and his father was never officially identified. He spent his childhood traveling across Europe with his mother and brother, living in Italy, Switzerland, and France. This nomadic lifestyle influenced his cosmopolitan character and his open, experimental approach to life and art. In his youth, he adopted the name Guillaume Apollinaire, a French version of his middle name, as a symbol of his literary identity in his adopted country, France. In Paris, Apollinaire quickly integrated into the city's artistic and literary circles, becoming friends and collaborators with key figures such as Pablo Picasso, Georges Braque, André Derain, and others. He was a passionate advocate of artistic avant-gardes, especially Cubism, and wrote essays and critiques that helped popularize the movement. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Apollinaire, though not a French citizen, volunteered to fight for France. He was accepted and served as an artilleryman on the front lines. During the war, he wrote poetry reflecting his experience in the conflict, including poems featured in calligrams. In 1916, he was seriously injured in the head by a piece of shrapnel. Although the injury was not fatal at the time, it deeply affected his health. After being discharged from the army, Apollinaire returned to Paris, where he continued writing and promoting avant-garde art. He was one of the first to use the term surrealism to describe his work and that of other artists seeking to go beyond conventional realism. However, his health never fully recovered after his war injury. In 1918, he contracted the Spanish flu, a pandemic that ravaged Europe at the time. He died on November 9, 1918, at the age of 38, just days before the end of the First World War. Guillaume Apollinaire left a lasting impact on literature, art, and modern culture. He was a key figure in the transition from symbolist poetry to modernism and a precursor to surrealism. His works, both in content and form, challenged conventions and expanded the possibilities of poetic language. Apollinaire is remembered as a poet who celebrated modernity but also as a deeply romantic and melancholic spirit. Works such as Le Pont Mirabeau and his calligrams continue to be studied and admired for their innovation and their ability to capture the contradictions and wonders of the modern world. Ernst Stadler, 1883–1914, was a German expressionist poet and a scholar renowned for his lyrical innovation and contributions to modern literature. Although his life was brief, his poetry reflects a profound sensitivity to modernity, movement, and human experience in a rapidly changing world. His death in the First World War silenced one of the many promising voices of his generation. Ernst Stadler was born on August 11, 1883, in Colmar, a city in Alsace that was then part of the German Empire, now in France. From a young age, he showed exceptional talent for literature and languages. He studied German philology at the University of Strasbourg and later continued his education at prestigious institutions like the University of Oxford, where he attended as a Rhodes Scholar. During his time in England, Stadler became familiar with contemporary English and European literature, including the works of Walt Whitman, whose influence was pivotal in his poetic development. Whitman inspired Stadler to explore free verse and experiment with new lyrical forms that reflected the vitality of modern life. After completing his studies, Stadler worked as a scholar and literary critic at universities in Brussels and Strasbourg. He was a distinguished academic in medieval German literature but also a passionate advocate of modern literature and expressionism. In 1913, he published his first and only poetry collection, Der Aufbruch, The Awakening. This work marked a milestone in expressionist literature with its focus on themes of modernity, movement, time, and individuality. The poems in Der Aufbruch celebrate the energy of urban and technological life while expressing a sense of melancholy about the fragility of human existence. Recurring themes in his work include modernity. Stadler explored the energy and dynamism of cities, trains, and mechanized life, celebrating their possibilities while acknowledging their alienating effects. Spiritual connection. Although a modernist, Stadler sought transcendence in human experience, delving into questions of time, mortality, and the search for meaning. Individual and collective tensions. His poetry reflects the tension between personal autonomy and the massive forces of modernity. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Stadler, like many of his generation, enlisted in the German army. While his poetry celebrated the vitality and energy of modern life, it was also infused with a sense of uncertainty about the world's changes, suggesting that his decision to join the conflict was driven more by patriotism than enthusiasm. On October 30, 1914, just a few months after the war began, Ernst Stadler was killed in the Battle of Ypres in Belgium. He was struck by an artillery shell while fighting on the Western Front. He was only 31 years old. Ernst Stadler's work, though tragically brief, had a significant impact on German expressionist poetry. Der Aufbruch, his sole book of poetry, is considered a masterpiece of the movement, capturing the spirit of modernity with fresh, dynamic, and deeply human language. Although his life was cut short, Stadler is remembered as one of the most promising figures in expressionist literature. His death in the First World War made him a symbol of the lost generation, young artists and intellectuals whose lives and talents were tragically truncated by the conflict. Today, Ernst Stadler is recognized for his ability to merge the modern spirit with timeless poetic sensitivity, making him a unique figure in early 20th century German and European literature. The war didn't just kill soldiers, it killed ideas, it killed verses. But their words survive. In books. In our memories. In history. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the lives and works of the writers we lost during the First World War. Subscribe for more stories that deserve to be told.